Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Hello and welcome back to the Big Story feed. I am Maria Castaigne, the lead producer of The Big Story. We're kicking off week 2 of Friends of Frequency, where we showcase all of our really cool and interesting hosts and shows on Frequency Podcast Network. You're getting Hogwash, The Reheat, Clock In, Bite Back, In This Economy, and of course, The Big Story. Today's episode is part 2 of a 2025 year in review for Canadian politics. Parliament Hill Bureau Chief Cormac McSweeney and political correspondent Glen McGregor take you through some of the biggest highlights in Canadian politics. It was a pretty interesting year for Canadian politics. Mark Carney was elected as the Prime Minister, all of this happening with the backdrop of U.S. President Donald Trump threatening to annex Canada and all of the tariff threats. You know, the big campaign promise of Mark Carney was to get a deal with the U.S., and after a few trips down south to the White House, still no deal. So reaction from Canadians, what do they feel about trusting Mark Carney to get that deal done? Also, Pierre Poilievre, the federal Conservative leader, a bit of a slippery slope for his caucus. We have a couple of his MPs crossing the floor, one resignation. He has his review coming up in January. It's going to be an interesting one. And of course, the future of the NDP, where does that lie? Our hosts dig into all of it for part 2 of a year in review for Canadian politics.
I'm Cormac McSweeney, Parliament Hill Bureau Chief for CityNews, and I'm joined once again by my colleague here in Ottawa, Glen McGregor, political reporter for CityNews. Glen, thanks very much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's always fun to look back on the past 12 months and figure out what we got right and got wrong.
Yeah, it's been a busy one. In fact, our first episode of this year in review on federal politics only brings us to April 28th during the election. So in that first episode, we of course talked about Justin Trudeau's resignation to kickstart the year on January 6th, the Liberal leadership race in which Mark Carney resoundingly won, and then the federal election where the Conservatives thought they were shoo-ins just months before, saw a big change in that Trump election where eventually the Liberals regained power or were able to retain power with a stronger minority just shy of a majority government. And that brings us to this portion now. So Glenn, they won the election and the Prime Minister had some policy decisions to make right off the bat to try and separate himself from the old government of Justin Trudeau. What was the first thing he did after taking office?
First thing he did, obviously, was swear in a cabinet. And he did continue to observe the tradition that Trudeau had begun of bringing in, or at least initially announcing, a gender-balanced cabinet, an equal number of men and women. If you take the Prime Minister out of the mix, he would push it over to the male side. So he did do that. I think there was some surprises about who was and wasn't allowed into cabinet. It was a surprise that, for example, Karina Gould was not brought in because she had run against Carney in the leadership race and had a lot of support in southwestern Ontario. She represents Burlington and had done very well in the leadership race and attracted a lot of younger people. I think a lot of women liked her. But if you look at kind of the way the cabinet broke down in that first cabinet, it was a lot of men in the key positions. Although he did keep Mélanie Joly on initially as foreign minister, and then she became industry minister after that. In terms of the policy, though, obviously the big policy decision he made, and I think this was after he won the leadership, when he became prime minister for the first time, he came in and said he was going to scrap the consumer component of the carbon tax. But it was after that election that we started hearing more and more, and I guess we'd heard this on the campaign trail, about the idea of Carney championing these nation-building infrastructure projects, things that he felt was going to stimulate the Canadian economy, bring in a lot more revenue, attract a lot of investment to the country, as a way of partially offsetting the economic impacts, especially on certain industries, of Donald Trump's tariffs. And that, of course, is still a work in progress. They are pursuing that. It also had the twin goal of possibly kind of trying to smooth some ruffled feathers with Alberta and their Premier Danielle Smith, who obviously was kind of a thorn in the side of Justin Trudeau, and constant and repeated complaints about things the federal government were doing that Smith felt were unfairly impinging, constraining Alberta's energy industry. I mean, go through she talked about the 9 terrible laws that she thought the federal government had passed. Sounds very Maoist terminology there. But Carney was, by getting behind these projects and making it clear that Alberta would be included in this, and potentially, as we know now, the discussion is on about another oil pipeline from Alberta to British Columbia, which Alberta has long sought, although there's real doubts about whether that thing will actually ever get off the ground. At least it was kind of an outreach to there. And at the same time, Carney embarked on this very intense travel schedule. He was traveling a lot this year, going to other countries, trying to, part of it was dealing with the situation in Ukraine and building alliances and trying to presenting a united front of European and Europe plus Canada against what some were seeing as a backsliding by the Trump administration in its support for Ukraine. So that was a big part of it. But the major part of it was going around and trying to form new trade alliances to make up for, again, what is expected to be a big reduction in exports to the United States because of the tariffs. So that was kind of, he was kind of focused on that. So he went, got a trade deal with Indonesia. He'd gone and met with Europe a bunch of times. They talked about participating in this European Defense Pact. So it was a very active year on the international stage while he was trying to balance some of these domestic things. And then, of course, working towards ultimately this budget that we got just earlier this month.
Yeah, and there a part of that as well was talking about NATO requirements, to go back to this and making commitments to hit our 2% target, which never happened under Trudeau by the end of this fiscal year, something also laid out in his budget, but then also committing to that 5% target by 2035, I believe, off the top of my head. But that's going to involve a lot more spending on our military, but they've been making moves to try and bring more stuff in. On the pipeline thing that you brought up as well, it's important to know for our listeners that under Trudeau and towards the tail end of Trudeau, there was a lot of talk even coming from the Alberta government about Alberta separation. And that separatist movement, which has always kind of been there in Alberta, was given more of a platform, more seriousness. And then once Carney got to the table and said, we're going to talk to you about a pipeline, we're not ruling this out, and they got to the negotiations that led to this MOU, you're definitely not hearing the same kind of language from Premier Danielle Smith anymore that you heard from her under Trudeau. So that relationship there, again, another example of Carney, as you noted, trying to really separate him from the previous government by making deals where it didn't seem possible before under Trudeau because of just that animosity in the relationship between both sides. But I just want to flip now as well, because on the U.S., the election was all about Trump, who was best to deal with Trump. And what we've seen is a lot of meetings with Trump, between Carney and Trump, a different relationship, as you noted in our first episode, between Carney and Trump and Trudeau and Trump. However, when it comes down to it, the criticism from the opposition is that we have not seen the results of that. If anything, we've seen more and more tariffs added on to Canada rather than seeing tariffs removed, and still no deal to get any relief yet.
And it's a totally valid criticism. I mean, it's the actual fact. We have not gotten any progress, although in fairness, no one has gotten any progress. And there's been these countries who have, under the leverage and threat of very heavy tariffs, have acquiesced and agreed to a deal, because Trump likes to say he's gotten trade deals. He's signing trade deals all the time. He has people calling him all the time, asking him, begging him for a deal. He loves to posture that way. But no one else has gotten any kind of relief of these tariffs, except maybe Switzerland, because they gave him a gold Rolex and a big bar of gold. I mean, like, that's, we haven't seen Carney do that. But I think it's a valid criticism of Carney, because he did run the election campaign saying he was the best person to deal with Trump, to stand up to him. But it hasn't made any difference. In fact, Carney has kind of climbed down at Trump's insistence on some policies, like the digital services tax. This was going to be a tax. It was going to bring in a lot of revenue by making the big internet giants, things like Amazon and Netflix and eBay, pay because they were making money off Canadians by selling, in some cases by selling advertising or selling subscriptions, but they weren't paying any taxes other than just HST on the services in certain cases. So the idea was, okay, we're going to start they weren't paying income taxes on those corporations. The idea we're going to start taxing them like any other company in Canada. And Carney actually backed down on that because Trump really didn't like the fact other companies were taxing essentially American internet giants. And so we backed down on that. And what do we get for that? Nothing. Trump has increased the tariffs, although the big win that happened really, and we often refer to this, kind of parenthetically or sort of an asterisk to our comments about the 35% tariff that I think we're now imposed on all goods coming from Canada. The asterisk, the exception, the exemption, the loophole for goods that are traded under the CUSMA, USMCA, NAFTA 2.0 deal are exempt from that. So that is the vast majority of Canadian goods. And I think there was when that decision was made by the Trump administration, obviously it saved a large swaths of the Canadian economy from potential collapse, actually. That was a huge, and that did take the pressure off a little bit, and then the focus shifted to the sectoral tariffs on steel, on aluminum, on softwood lumber, and crucially on the auto sector. That really became where this conversation is happening. But you are right, Cormac, there is really no progress that Carney has made in this now over 9 months that he's been Prime Minister.
Part of the way to deal with all of this was trying to give relief to those sectors that are feeling the pinch the most. But a lot of that also came with the first budget from Mark Carney. A lot of eyes on that budget to see how they would try to transform our economy to cushion the blow from the U.S. trade war. But it came with a big deficit price tag. What did you think of that first budget?
Yeah, I mean, Carney's office had really tried to set the table on this and manage expectations about this budget because they started raising this issue about differentiating between operational spending and investment, right? So, and this is also a fair approach to take because when a government goes out and builds a bridge, for example, that is considered in their accounting a loss. That's just they don't consider the fact that bridge will create enormous economic activity, which will result in people paying more taxes, and the bridge will very likely pay for itself through the increased economic activity that generates tax revenues for governments. So it's different in that way from a private business that would consider that to be a capital cost investment and would depreciate it over years and years. We don't really do that in the federal government. So that's what Carney was trying to do, was bring sort of like a little business accountancy to this. But at the end of the day, we had that enormous deficit. Was it $70 billion? It's a blur now. $70 billion was the
I'll
final
have to
figure.
Google it again because it was, I think it was larger than that, but 72 maybe, but yeah.
Yeah, and the budget didn't chart out any path towards a balanced budget either. And, we haven't had that happen since really the end of the Harper era. We haven't had a balanced budget. We've been increasingly, deficit been increasing. I've been on the Hill long enough to remember in the 1990s when federal government running deficits was politically toxic. And it was Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin as finance minister, Chrétien as PM, that actually got the deficit under control, brought it back, the government books back into surplus. Eventually, even though our economy at one point was heading in a very seriously bad direction, we're being compared negatively to Argentina in terms of with the Canadian peso, the Canadian dollar was doing poorly. But then deficits became really politically charged items, and I think voters don't feel the same way anymore. They don't react as strongly to, okay, so the Carney government ran up a, how many $1 billion deficit. Nobody seems to be that concerned about deficits anymore. Under Trudeau, the government started switching to using this different way of expressing the deficit as looking at debt, our total debt as a percentage of our GDP to show that it was manageable and compared to other peer nations in the OECD or the G20. But so I don't think it's that the big deficit in the budget wasn't really the main item that I was interested in. Budgets, we get really excited about them on Parliament Hill, and they invariably tend to be 1 week of stories, and then people kind of go back to living their lives. and they don't really change the direction of things. I mean, was there anything that you thought was really surprising?
No. I mean, I just looked it up. $78.3 billion was the thing, but we had bandied about a bunch of numbers ahead of the budget, which may explain some of the confusion we had there.
Right.
But nonetheless, 78.3, the largest deficit outside of the COVID-19 pandemic for our country. However, yeah, I think the voter response was that this is needed at a time when we need to reshape our economy. I think the messaging that the Liberals had done ahead of that really garnered the acceptance of the public. But, the Conservatives, which follows their playbook really well, they gave a much lower figure and said the deficit can't go above that. So they even recognize there should be deficit spending at this time. However, they don't think it should be to the degree that the Liberals did, which, follows, if you've been following the Conservatives at all over the past, few generations, that tracks pretty much exactly with where they stand on things. But I think what happened around the budget was probably more interesting, and it was a defection from the Conservatives to the Liberals. Chris D'Entremont sparking what has been at least a couple of defections now.
Yeah, and you're right. This was a more interesting story than the budget itself, was the aftermath of the budget and attempts to get it passed into law. So, of course, after any budget, the government that introduces it has to bring a Ways and Means motion that is voted on in the House of Commons. And because it's a money bill, it is deemed to be a matter of confidence. So that means if the bill is voted down or motion is voted down, then the government is said to have lost the confidence of the House of Commons, and Mark Carney will be making another trip back to Rita Hall to see the Governor General and asking her to dissolve Parliament. But it was very close, right? So coming into that, the Liberals had were 3 seats short of a majority status, but one of their members was serving as the speaker, so he couldn't vote unless there was a tie on the vote. So it was very, very narrow. And then all of a sudden you had Chris D'Entremont, who was not a super well-known MP, but well-known in Nova Scotia, certainly, in Nova Scotia Conservative politics, because he had been a MLA in Nova Scotia as a progressive Conservative. He was considered to be the front runner for the speaker's job from the opposition side when Greg Fergus was named speaker, and D'Entremont ended up as the deputy speaker, and he was upset that he wasn't being able to compete for that job again when it came open this time, and apparently some bad blood over that, and that's why he decided to cross the floor. And then you had this whole drama about another one, this guy Matt Genereux, again, not a household name, but relatively well-known in Alberta, from MP from Edmonton, and he was being rumored right after D'Entremont. Within hours after, people were talking about Matt Genereux, is he going to be next? People were calling his office repeatedly, and then ultimately he decides he's going to resign as an MP, but not until next spring. So that whole thing was very weird, and I still don't really understand. I mean, there's theories that people have about what kind of pressure Genereux was under, but it did really underscore how close things are in the Parliament we're functioning in right now, and what a tight political environment it is.
Yeah, and I mean, the defections obviously not good for Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, who is dealing with questions of his leadership as a result of that. And he's got his leadership review coming up in the end of January at the party convention in Calgary, which is a standard review that happens every time the party loses an election. They have a convention after, and there has to be a mandatory leadership review. And so he's facing that with a lot of questions. And that leads us to what's to come in 2026. So what are you keeping an eye on in 2026 on federal politics?
Well, until 2026, I'm keeping an eye on possibility of more defections, because we've had also, after the defection of D'Entremont, we've had another Conservative MP, again, a guy really nobody had ever heard of before, named Michael Maw, was elected for the first time in the April election in the riding of Markham-Unionville, and probably won that seat because the Liberal-nominated candidate, Paul Chang, a former police officer in Toronto, there was some concerns about things he had said about a Conservative candidate in another riding, and he was forced to resign, step down midway through the campaign. That was one of those little, bozo eruptions, we call them, or bimbo eruptions. And Maw was able to win that seat as a Conservative. He figures now his chances are better as a Liberal. So I'm watching to see, are there going to be any more of those? We've had hints. We've had Stephen McKinnon, who was the Liberal House leader, saying that he thinks there are other Liberals out there. We had the Minister of Natural Resources, Tim Hodgson, the other day saying he's been contacted more than once about inquiries about the possibility of Conservatives crossing the floor. This is the central story at the beginning of 2026. We essentially have leadership issues in two parties. The Conservatives, also the NDP, is electing a new leader at the end in March sometime. Not a lot of excitement for that race, but the review of Poilievre's leadership, as you say, it's mandated, so it has to happen under the party rules. I'm curious to see what number he's going to come in at, and you're going to be out there in Calgary for that vote. That's going to be amazing. I would guess, the number he's shooting for is 80%. Anything less than that is going to be seen as weakness. Anything less than, say, 70%, I think real problems for Poilievre continuing on, although just the way you look at his sort of political style that he's shown both as an MP and since he became leader in 2022, is that he doesn't back down. And I'm wondering, even if he gets 51% of the vote, he might stay on. I don't know. I don't know how he's going to react to whatever the figure is, and whether or not, if he comes in a low level, whether that will cause other Conservative MPs to consider crossing the floor too. What do you think?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because we saw Bonnie Crombie at the Ontario provincial level try to stay on, but it was a very brief attempt to stay on. I think she got around 60%, maybe a bit less, but she thought that she could try and stay on, and then very quickly she decided to resign and denied any suggestion that she was pushed out by her own caucus with that one. But technically, 51% gets you there. So, but the pressure would be on to step aside if it was a really low number. It's hard to see if it gets close to 80%. I think there could be that possibility, but also the way that it's being designed is different than some other parties do it. And so this membership review is the ridings get the votes, and there's a point system. And so it's not exactly the same as one member, one vote. We did see Thomas Mulcair with the NDP get the boot from his party after he failed to get them into government. And that was a scenario where you had NDP members voting on this. So different parties do it differently. They can do everything on their own, how they want to get it done. But that was one of those. I think there's more room for Pierre Poilievre to have a good showing at this convention. The question is whether he makes it there or not, if there are more defections, if there's more pressure. And then just very quickly for 2026, are you expecting any potential federal election? Could we see some potential provincial referendum issues pop up? What else are you expecting there?
Yeah, I think we can safely say there isn't going to be a serious referendum in Alberta. At least with this pipeline thing on the go. I think the separatist sentiments have been largely quelled in Alberta. I'm not sure they were all that strong to begin with. I think it was a rump of people who are always unhappy with the federal government, who sort of got organized and saw a champion potentially in Danielle Smith. I don't think that's going to be an issue. The Quebec situation different though, because we're very likely going to have an election before October. We have to have a provincial election in Quebec by October. Looks like very much like the Parti Québécois is going to win that and is going to try again for another referendum in Quebec on sovereignty. Who knows when that would actually occur, whether or not them winning an election would actually create the winning conditions for a referendum. I sort of doubt it. I think the separatist movement in Quebec has really abated, even though people continue to elect Bloc Québécois MPs to Ottawa and PQ members to Quebec. So I don't think that's going to be a federal election. Well, I think that really depends on whether we get any other MPs crossing the floor. Right now, the Carney government is still in kind of a honeymoon. He is relatively popular, but you look at the public opinion polling on party choice, it shows you that the Liberals and the Conservatives are pretty much neck and neck. The big drag for the Conservatives is Poilievre is not personally popular, really unpopular with women, unpopular even with older people, which once was a prime constituency. So I think it will depend on what happens with whether Poilievre hangs around. So I think if he does, I don't see the Conservatives suddenly itching for an election unless things change a lot over. And as we know, we started these podcasts talking about how things have changed since a year ago. Think about when we're doing this podcast next year. Hopefully, we'll both still be upright by then, and things may have changed dramatically. The Carney government could lose its shine. He could become personally unpopular. There could be a resolution of the trade issues with the United States. We don't know what's going to happen in the war in Ukraine. There's so many things up in the air. It's impossible to predict. But yes, as of this moment, Cormac, as you know, we are still in minority government status. An election could happen anytime.
All right. Glen McGregor, City News political reporter, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Howard.
And I'm Cormac McSweeney, Parliament Hill Bureau Chief for City News. That was the Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening.